Hello learners, I am Poulomi and today we are going to learn about the various forms or types of listening which is part of the BES course 124. During our waking hours, we are constantly bombarded with sounds and words. Though we hear almost everything, we do not listen to everything we hear. In fact, we cannot listen to everything. Our brain is not programmed to pay attention and cognitively decode every sound that enters the oral cavity. Hearing is, therefore, a sense, but listening is a skill that human beings gradually develop as they steadily acquire linguistic abilities. It is one of the foremost skills that helps a person to make sense of the acoustic inputs he hears, to confer meaning and significance to the sounds and syllables that he encounters, and in effect accrue information and gain knowledge. Unfortunately, society assumes that with age, learners of a particular language would eventually attain a level of listening ability that will be enough for helping them survive through day-to-day situations. Though this is partially true, in a classroom where students have to confront new vocabulary and novel ideas regularly, the receptive skill of listening has to be particularly honed and sharpened so that they can imbibe, decode, and process information that will help them learn more as well as respond and communicate effectively according to the situational demands. However, as teachers, we often ignore the requirement to develop this seminal skill in our students as we believe that listening will be naturally taken care of and doesn't require practicing, or that there are hardly any language tasks across the curriculum that would be suitable for our class content, or that the other cognitive skills like reading, speaking, writing are more valuable and therefore requires more time and focus. But this attitude can detrimentally affect the manner and pace at which students learn in a classroom. Listening with intention and attention is one of the vital ways in which knowledge can be transferred and created in learning environments. Listening is a multi-layered skill. It allows the brain to apply meaning to sound, to establish vocabulary, develop receptive and expressive language, organize and categorize information, and finally learn and internalize knowledge. Listening is indeed where hearing meets the brain. Therefore, teachers can greatly benefit if they can devise teaching methodologies and tasks that improve listening capacities in their students. To productively tap onto the advantages that an attentive listening session can provide for students, teachers ought to understand the various situations that demand the various types of listening practices. Linguists and pedagogues have come up with different models to differentiate various kinds of listening practices. The intended response or outcome of listening session, reciprocal and non-reciprocal listening, the level and process of involvement of the listeners, listening for specific purposes, listening for gist and extensive listening, or the situational demands like marginal listening, appreciative listening, academic listening, conversational listening, and creative listening form the baseline for the categorization of listening practices. Though there is no absolute model for labeling the different kinds of listening practices, there are definitely overlaps of ideas and concepts. I would like to position the concept of intention at the center of my categorization of listening practices. When listening happens in situations where we have no intention to focus and pay attention to the auditory input, it is termed as inactive or passive or marginal listening. This is the kind of listening we unconsciously engage in most of the time. For example, when we are working on an assignment and there is a cricket match being telecasted on the television in the background, or when different groups of students are discussing their projects in their respective groups in the same classroom and can overhear each other but are not alerted till the teacher announces that their discussion time is over. In passive listening situations like these, the listener can momentarily and voluntarily tune in and zone out from the auditory inputs. That is, they can temporarily shift their attention from the activity at hand. This kind of listening happens on numerous occasions outside the classroom as well. In fact, this ability is very useful in situations where we have to attend to only what we want to hear and tune out everything else. For example, while focusing on a task amidst a noisy and disturbing environment. However, when we listen to a song and appreciate the skill of its composer and listener. However, when we listen to a song and appreciate the skill of its composer and listener, or when we listen to the teacher and make notes in a history class, or follow the voice instructions on Google Maps to reach our destination, or when we listen to a grieving friend and counsel them with friendly advice, we have to listen with intention. I have broadly outlined the three kinds of intentions that would, in effect, decide the kind of listening the listener is engaging in. Listening with the intention to appreciate and derive aesthetic pleasure from the listening activity is termed as appreciative listening. Listening with the intention to understand and gather information and enhance knowledge demands attentive listening. Listening without any judgment but with patience, mostly to resolve internal and external conflicts, is known as empathetic listening. When we listen to our favorite song or a dramatized reading of a story or a playtext or the recitation of a poem by our favorite author, we get emotionally involved in the process. Our reactions and responses in instances of such listening sessions are colored with our degree of involvement and identification with the situation and characters of the auditory text in question. In a classroom, a teacher can deploy this aspect of appreciative listening and facilitate a sense of aesthetic sensibility in their students by drawing attention to the affect and effect of the auditory input and eliciting responses that might assess their grasp over the global meaning of the text. However, in recitation, music, and performance classes, appreciative listening would eventually contribute to the academic aspects of engaging with resources. But there are situations in life that require accurate comprehension, as the information received in the auditory input is of paramount importance. For example, in announcements, introductions, instructions, or explanations, if a person fails to understand what is being said or remember any portion of the information they listen to, they are expected to interject the auditory input, clarify their understanding by interrogating the speaker or asking them to repeat until adequate comprehension is achieved. To train students in this kind of attentive listening, teachers can design activities based on directions, wherein students carry out a task or an experiment by closely following the instructions step by step. Depending on the learning focus of their discipline-specific content, teachers can devise listening activities that could help learners to better grasp ideas, critique perspectives, and provide their argumentative responses as intended. Responses being the primary denominator to assess students' understanding and cognitive progress. If the way how learners interact with the auditory input decides the manner in which they glean information from it, then listening with rapt attention is the only way forward. However, holding the attention of the students for a prolonged duration is a challenging task. Even more if it is in a second language, which is the case in many Indian classrooms. As listening in these scenarios become extremely difficult, teachers need to think carefully about making their activities successful and content interesting. This will not only keep the motivation quotient of the classroom high, but help teachers to capitalize the learner's background knowledge and interests and thus activate schema, so that learners can apply that knowledge and those interests to become effective listeners. I would apply Michael Rost's framework on categorizing listening based on learning and activity focus as discussed in his book Teaching and Researching Listening by Pearson Education in 2011 to my category of attentive listening. Let us concentrate on this table here that Rost lays out on page 183 of his book. Let us all take some time and reflect on this table. All these listening practices, as you would have surely observed, involve attentive listening. Rost is of the opinion that a balanced approach to listening instruction would aim to include all 6 types, with an instructional priority on those types that offer the most engagement and are consistent with learning and assessment goals. Let us try to understand what each of these listening types implies. Intensive listening refers to listening to a text closely with the intention to decode the input for purposes of analysis. To achieve this, listeners have to pay close attention to precise sounds, words, phrases, grammatical and pragmatic units. This interactive focus on becoming active as a listener. Intensive listening facilitates a higher level of comprehension and is apt for students where the listener has to hunt for specific information or spot a particular word. Apart from enhancing listening proficiency, intensive listening strengthens a learner's language-focused learning. To help students exercise this particular kind of receptive skill, teachers can include a compulsory intensive listening session, no matter how small, as part of their lesson plan. According to Ross, the activities that can involve intensive listening in a classroom could be dictation, elicited repetition, shadowing, word spotting, error spotting, grammar processing, and mediation. Rod Ellis advises the long-term teaching of grammar through input processing, which includes intensive listening rather than through deductive presentations, as it augments learners' skill of noticing, particularly the grammatical features of the language. However, he admits that this is very difficult for learners, particularly if the features are redundant, that is, are not essential for understanding the meaning. Therefore, it is essential that teachers use authentic texts that have a topicality and curiosity that will attract students in spite of potential linguistic difficulties. This is the grammar discovery approach, where learners analyze the data in order to arrive at an understanding of how a grammatical feature works. Selective listening is basically listening with a planned purpose in mind, often to gather specific information to perform a task. In fact, it is almost the appropriate precursor to more complex and extended academic listening sessions. To help students ideate, teachers can devise graded listening lessons that would help students learn to listen and get facts so that they become ready to listen and get ideas. Identifying the facts could involve spotting any of these: numbers and numerical relationships, letters, sounds, abbreviations, spellings, directions and spatial relations, time and temporal sequences, dates and chronological order, measurements and amounts, proportion, comparison and contrast, and then taking notes of this factual information. Note-taking, which is a very useful macro skill in the lecture listening comprehension environment, has a high degree of practical value and psychological validity for learners, as it is a mode of self-assessing their listening abilities. To further help students develop their selective listening ability, teachers can ask students to perform specific actions during note-taking, like writing down certain words or phrases, copying material on the board in appropriate places in their notes, listening topics, or labeling parts of their notes. According to Rost, the pre-listening portion of the instruction is crucial to fine-tune students' receptive skills. This phase may include a short activity to preview upcoming vocabulary or concepts or discourse frameworks that will help students engage with the listening extract, or to discuss pictures, photos, cartoons, and memes even, and provoke some predictions, or to elicit what students already know about the topic or add a personal experience to pique their interest. Rost continues that teachers can even provide a short list of provocative questions such as, do you agree or disagree with the following statements on the upcoming topic to help activate schemata and emotions related to the listening extract. Any of these activities alone or in combination may serve to activate the background knowledge students will need to listen well. Effective pre-listening activities heighten the degree of relevance for listening, which fuels motivation. This ensures that students are not cold or discouraged about what they are going to listen to. Interactive listening is a type of conversational interaction in which the listener takes a leading role in understanding through providing feedback, asking questions, and supporting the speaker. This kind of listening emphasizes the learner to articulate this understanding by forcing comprehensible output, which in turn forges negotiations and facilitates learning new linguistic forms through collaborative discourses between the learners. In order to ensure that the students engage in interactive listening, teachers need to provide structural communicative tasks. That is, a problem that necessarily needs exchange of ideas and thus elicits negotiation of linguistic forms to arrive at a tangible solution or outcome. Examples of such tasks are students collectively filling information gaps in an oral text or reconstructing possible endings to unfinished narratives. An effective communication circuit between people cannot exist unless each participant becomes an equal partner in communication through back-channeling. Back-channeling are verbal or non-verbal responses like phatic expressions that we generally use, like yay, woohoo, right. And a person can interject these expressions in a conversation with another person. What these expressions do is that they reveal the learner's understanding and attention. Apart from back-channeling, providing responses and initiating repair when communication gets disrupted is an important part of the communication circuit. Teachers can actually use explicit instructions to formulate these strategies to ensure that students are involved in interactive listening. Teachers can actually use explicit instructions to formulate these strategies to ensure that students are involved in interactive listening. According to Katharina Bremer, a German sociolinguistic researcher, teachers ought to focus on the use of explicit responses to understanding problems. For example, metalinguistic comments such as, "I'm not sure I understand this," and the use of partial repetition to distinguish the elements that were not understood. For example, the speaker says, "This is the perfect antidote to depression," and the listener interjects by asking, "Perfect antidote what?" This is an example that has been quoted by Rost. She adds that teachers should also encourage learners to formulate hypotheses, to develop high inferencing capacities, to stay active in the struggle for understanding. In classroom settings, two-way collaborative tasks which operate on the listener's control over the conversation by turn-taking, seeking feedback, and clarifying through confirmation checks are highly effective to promote interactive listening skills. Extensive listening refers to listening for several minutes at a time, staying in the target language, usually with a long-term goal of appreciating and learning the content. Extensive listening includes academic listening, sheltered language instruction, and listening for pleasure. The last one is something that I have already explained under the label of appreciative listening. In the academic space, students are often confronted with the requirement to engage in extensive listening. To ensure that the extensive listening experience is productive for the learner, the listening input should be fairly understood even in the first episode of listening. This is even more important if it involves an L2 learner. Unless high levels of learner satisfaction and comprehension is targeted, extensive listening can be boring and unproductive. Therefore, to ensure comprehensibility, additional support material should be shared with the listener prior to the listening session. Things like prior readings, pre-learning of key vocabulary or concepts, or during the actual listening process, like graphics, subtitles, help menus, etc. Rost also mentions that this strategy of incorporating support elements into academic listening has been described under the nomenclature of sheltered instruction, in which learners are literally protected from being overwhelmed by too much information to process effectively. The Sheltered Instruction Observation Protocol (SIOP) that Rost shares is a very useful guide for teachers to support students in an extensive listening environment. It could include lesson participation. These are the aspects teachers can keep in mind while preparing the lessons and deciding on the background, comprehensible input, strategies, interaction, application, and lesson delivery. Along with these strategies, the productive outcome of an extensive listening session can be accentuated if teachers provide detailed comprehension strategy instructions. This will avoid the feeling of being overwhelmed with the quantity of oral input and help students to get back on track in case they experience difficulties in comprehension. Rost also emphasizes that extensive listening done in an academic context or in an autonomous learning context, for example, while doing homeworks or in the learning lab, is useful for improving automaticity in oral language processing and is valuable for building confidence of the listener. Apart from the sheer joy one derives from listening to something they like, extensive listening practices are also useful for students who wish to encounter and understand rich, authentic content for projects and presentations. Responsive listening refers to a type of listening practice in which the listener's response is the goal of the activity. The listener's response in this type of activity is affective, expressing an opinion or a point of view, rather than informational, that is, giving back facts based on what was heard. The experience of listening to political debates or comic talk shows falls in this category. What I may find offending or agreeable can be starkly different from what another person perceives from the same input. These differences might be because of the cultural, social, geographical, ideological, or gender situatedness of the listener. It is interesting to note that the listener's personal prejudices, judgments, and opinions would inevitably color the responsive output of this kind of listening. One of the structured methods that teachers can use to facilitate responsive listening in their students is a paused task. Rather than trying to explain what this means myself, I will take help of a sample paused task idea shared by Shireen Farooq, a Pakistani English teacher that Rost quotes. After looking at the various aspects of the task, Farooq actually gives us an example of a folk tale which he uses for a paused task activity. Let us explain what it looks like. Once there was a very proud fox. One day he was walking in the woods and, this is the first pause point, he stepped into a trap, or what is it? His tail was caught in a trap. He pulled and pulled and, second pause point. This pause could elicit the response, he escaped. Then the story continues. But his tail was left in the trap. He was very sad and that he lost his tail, but he was also very, third pause point, and students can fill it up. When he went back to the pack, he said, fourth pause point. And students can fill this gap again with anything they want the narrative to look like. All the other foxes and the story continues. This activity, Farooq says, does not take much preparation and the students like it because they all get to participate. And at the end, Farooq plays the entire story and this gives the students a feeling of satisfaction. Let us now understand what autonomous listening means. According to Rose, autonomous listening refers to independent listening without the direct guidance of an instructor. Autonomous listening can include all the types of listenings discussed: intensive, selective, extensive, interactive, responsive. The key is that the learner is seemingly in control of input selection, task completion, and assessment. Though it might seem that in autonomous listening, the teacher hardly has any role to play, but that is not true. Teachers can still guide students with strategies that will help them self-assess their listening ability. To understand this, let's discuss an idea shared by Brett Reynolds, a teacher from Canada, and quoted in Rust. Films, as we know, are a rich source of developing autonomous listening in students. However, while watching good films, there is a high chance that students get carried away and they do not keep tab of information or observations. To provide assistance and structure to their students while self-assessing their learning, Brett provides a transcript from selected scenes and shares an exercise bank with them. These are some of the questions Brett asked with reference to the movie What's Eating Gilbert Grape? Those include a few empathetic questions. After discussing the questions that this teacher shares with the students, let us now understand what empathetic listening means. Empathetic listening is listening with empathy. And this is going to be the last kind of listening I'm going to discuss in today's lecture. To understand this, we must first understand how much is empathy different from sympathy. What happens when we listen to someone with empathy? Well, sympathy calls for a sense of pity for someone or someone's miserable condition. However, empathetic feelings are generated from a sense of being in the other person's shoes. This kind of non-judgmental listening calls out for patience and sensitivity on part of the listener. Instead of hijacking the conversation, empathetic listening allows the space for the listener and the speaker to completely open up and divulge their issues and internal conflicts. The focus here shifts from the listener back to the speaker, though the speaker and the listener are both actively present. The emphasis is not to engage in a reciprocal conversation, but to let the speaker unburden their hidden and deep-rooted fears and traumas. A listening session like this can often have therapeutic potentials. However, this does not mean that the listener is not responsive. In fact, the listener ought to ask probing questions that might reveal newer and unforeseen solutions to the problems at hand. A conversation that involves empathetic listening generally hinges on concern and care for the individual or issue in question. Even in academic scenarios, the practice of empathetic listening is slowly gaining ground. In fact, as teachers, when we listen to students' problems, we must lend them an honest, empathetic ear. This, I believe, is an integral aspect of an ideal learning environment. To sum up, all kinds of listening practices pivot on varying shades of intention and varying degrees of listening strategies like predicting, making inferences, monitoring, clarifying, and responding on part of the listener. And to fully reap the benefits of the receptive skill of listening across the curriculum, teachers need to find novel ways of enhancing learner involvement, motivation, and autonomy. That's all for today. Thank you.